Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. I'm your host, Paul Vogelzang, and today we're turning back the clock to the summer of 1965, a time when music wasn't just entertainment, it was a revolution. A single song hit the airwaves on July 24th, so just about a month ago, but many, many years ago of the year 1965, and it changed everything. That song, of course, is Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. Whether you remember hearing it for the first time or are discovering it today for the first time, there's no denying its power and influence. To help us dive into the groundbreaking moment in music history, we have a very special returning guest, Scott Shea. Scott is a leading music historian. He's author of the best-selling book, All the Leaves Are Brown, How the Mamas and the Papas Came Together and Broke Apart. He's here to share his insights on how Like a Rolling Stone shattered conventions, pushed boundaries, and paved the way for the folk rock movement in America. We'll explore how the 6-minute masterpiece by Dylan managed to captivate a nation and why its impact still resonates nearly 60 years later. We'll be playing it throughout the show, and I know you'll just love this song and go away singing it, as I always do. Scott, of course, brings a wealth of knowledge, not only as an author, but also as a longtime radio producer, currently working on Sirius XM's Seize the Day with Gus Lloyd. Scott's expertise will give us a unique perspective on why Like a Rolling Stone was more than just a song, it was a cultural moment. So sit back and relax. Let's take a trip down memory lane to the time when Bob Dylan turned the music world on its head. Welcome, Scott Shea, back to the program. Scott Shea, so good to talk to you. Happy summer. Great to connect again with you.
Hey, thanks for having me back, man. I really appreciate it. It's great.
Oh, gosh. I love it, too. You know, we talked about your book, about the Mamas and the Papas. Fantastic subject. All the Leaves Are Brown. Such a hit with our audience. It's so nice to talk to you again. We're going to talk today about Bob Dylan's music, a little bit, well, specifically about Like a Rolling Stone, one of my favorite all-time songs. So many love that song, too. And, we all have our stories about Dylan's music, where we heard it. What inspired you about Dylan's music? And then maybe talk a little bit about Dylan and just this big impact that he has had on folk rock in particular.
Well, I've been into his music for a really long time. Really, probably not when I was a really little kid, but when I got into my teenage years. He's definitely an acquired taste for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I was certainly one growing up, but in my mid to late teenage years, when I kind of opened my mind up to the full sounds of, not only 60s music, but 70s and beyond, I gravitated to this period of Bob Dylan, which Like the Rolling Stone was in, which would be the mid 60s, 65 and 66. And because it sounded similar to the Beatles and the Stones and the Byrds, who I really enjoyed, and a lot of the cutting edge bands of that period. So the Mamas and the Papas, I couldn't write their story without writing about Bob Dylan a little bit, because, it was part of that folk rock craze. And they were all ex-folk musicians, and they were in Greenwich Village with him at the time. He was kind of the prince of Greenwich Village. So I'm sure there were all mixed feelings. They probably were in awe of him at times. They probably were jealous. They probably hated him. They probably thought he was overrated. Like all those things that go on when you're in that scene, but ultimately we're just really impressed with and followed him into this folk rock spectrum. And John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, and guys like John Sebastian, who was friends with Bob, and David Crosby, anybody from that period were drawn to him. And I was as well. And that music, not that I'm up there with them, but as I got into music, I just really loved the folk stuff that came before that. I've learned to enjoy it and appreciate it more now, but it wasn't my first thing with Bob. It was really the full sound of the rock and roll band behind him that caught my ear, and I would say millions of others.
And Like a Rolling Stone was really he really made a big turn there from folk to rock. He played electric guitar. He really did some interesting things with that organ. Al Cooper, I think, played the organ there. It's such a groundbreaking song. And here we are almost at 60 years. It's almost 60 years old. So I'm 68. I do remember this really so well. I got to tell you, that question, how does it feel? I always remember that in that song. It just resonated.
Yeah.
Same with you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's such an open-ended question.
Yeah.
Right. But how does it feel? How does it feel to what? But it's, that song is just loaded with all different types of emotions, like scathing sarcasm and bitter irony and all these things, that I think really attracted that era, that growing counterculture movement from the mid 60s that really, had its roots in the 50s, really kind of like with the beatnik period. But I think it was bubbling under the surface, and this I really think brought it to the fore, absolutely helped it bring it to, not by itself, but the beatnik refugees and the underground hippie movement that was really kind of focused on the West Coast, but through this and other things, development of the sophistication of the Beatles songwriting and the Rolling Stones, I think just brought it full force, because you have a combination of that small group with the millions of teenagers and young adults who are just listening to the radio and just trying to enjoy music. And then they hear this song which has these heady lyrics that ask that open-ended question that we just talked about. And, with a nice beat to it and some good music that you can dance to. So it helped bring it to the mainstream, I should say.
Yeah, it was an open-ended question. And then the other line that just jumps out to me is, and this is a really positive line, as far as I'm concerned, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. And I think that's a line that is from a song that is about perseverance and hanging in there. And I think that's always good for us to think about. In these challenging times, it's good to remember that sometimes just losing everything, putting it all behind you, allows you to focus a little bit on the future.
Yeah, especially when you're young, you really don't have anything to lose. So, that's when you need to try things. And for me, I mean, did things like, trying a different career path or a different relationship or a different direction, kind of like right there with No Direction Home, So it's another one of a profound Dylan lyric. And, it's funny because, I've seen interviews with him and they always ask him, like, where did these lyrics come from? And he's just like, I don't know. I don't even remember writing them, So it's, and I know how that feels because I look back at my book and I was like, I don't remember writing that, but it came from somewhere. I think you get into that zone and you're just trying to make things sound good and make a rhyme or just finish a sentence, and you pull things and some of them are inspired and some of them aren't.
Scott Shea, absolutely. The Mamas and the Papas book, All the Leaves Are Brown, is inspired. It's wonderful. You pulled that off absolutely and just brilliantly. And of course, again, Scott Shea's our guest today. We're talking about Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan. I've read, Scott Shea, that you talk a little bit about Like a Rolling Stone, and you describe it as being almost a response to the British invasion. Tell us a little bit about that and who Dylan was contemporaries with and how their music shaped some of the folk rock music and how he participated in that, because it was a real interesting time there for music. Yeah, well, in the wake of the British invasion, American artists were really taking a beating. Really wiped out just about everybody who came before it, except for maybe Elvis. Well, definitely Elvis, and maybe a couple others like Chuck Berry and Sam Cooke, and there's probably more than that. But I think the best of the next generation of American rock and roll singers were folk singers who were involved in the folk movement in Greenwich Village, and there was one in Chicago and in San Francisco. And I think when the Beatles arrived, it rekindled their love for rock and roll. You remember that time of Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry, where it just kind of was revolutionary and it got them excited and scared their parents to death, But with the British invasion, fickle record label executives, they just weren't interested in even letting you in the door if you didn't have a British accent. And many of them will talk about that. And I think Columbia Records was the first to really take a chance with the Byrds. Of course, the Byrds really looked British, their haircuts and everything, and the glasses and the Rickenbacker. They released that cover of Mr. Tambourine Man. And it was really the first response to that onslaught, which came after the Beatles, because you had like the Dave Clark Five and the Jerry and the Pacemakers and the Searchers, even the Rolling Stones. And then Dylan came along right there with Like a Rolling Stone after that. And you had Love and Spoonful with Do You Believe in Magic, and then Barry McGuire, Eve of Destruction, and here comes the Mamas and the Papas with California Dreamin'. So the next thing you know, you have a sound and a movement that matches the energy of the British invasion. And it's got its own unique sound. Artists in no way affiliated with that folk movement, like Sonny and Cher and Trini Lopez, are putting out like folk rock sounding songs. I think Dylan, like those people I mentioned, John Phillips, John Sebastian,
Zalyanowski, Barry McGuire, they all roamed in those same folk circles. Folk music, it was arranged differently. There was different tuning, there were different chord progressions and stuff like that. And it lent itself to rock and roll in just a beautiful way that, the British, they didn't have that, then they might have had it a little bit, Donovan is certainly, but I even think Donovan was probably influenced by the folk rock groups, probably more so than British folk music, at least at that period of time. Then you have the Beatles. They're putting out Help and Rubber Soul, and they're starting to incorporate these folk rock sounds into songs like If I Needed Someone or Nowhere Man and things like that. The way I describe it, it's like if you want to compare it to the original British invasion from the Revolutionary War, this was kind of like the Battle of Saratoga, which was like the first American victory.
Right.
So
right.
That was kind of my point with that.
Yeah, that's really true. You just mentioned all those names too. John Sebastian, Lovin' Spoonful, of course, Paul Revere and the Raiders, all of these great sounds. Dylan had a different sound. His vocal style was not that crisp, clear. You think of Lennon and McCartney, you think of John Sebastian, you think of all those singers, and they really had, and the folk singers too. I'm thinking of some of those really well-known folk bands at the time. They all had these beautiful folk trained voices, and Dylan did not. You think that separated him too? He really wasn't kind of the archetype there. He was really alone. Yeah,
I mean, he could hold a note, but he had limited range. He was a teenager in that first wave of rock and roll, the first generation with Elvis and Bill Haley and all them. And I think he was less afraid than others to bring in kind of that rock and roll spirit into the music from that first generation, because even in those early years, the best singers had great voices like Elvis and Roy Orbison. And then you had guys they may have not been as great a singer as Elvis and Roy Orbison, but they had pleasant sounds like Ricky Nelson and Chuck Berry. And Bob Dylan was really none of those. I think he surrounded himself with some great, or I should say Columbia Records surrounded himself with some great producers that really were able to work with that. And I think he was able to really kind of maybe the first artist to bring that rock and roll attitude into rock and roll, because you still had the old guard where, you have to be a good singer. And Bob, he really wasn't, but he made up for it with his songwriting. Mm-hmm. And I think that was kind of deliberate because Bob Dylan is a very deliberate kind of guy, and his songs were so strong, and I think he knew it. And like I said, it became an acquired taste, but it was something that it's like coffee or beer that once you really get into it, you can really get into it and really enjoy it. His voice is constantly changed, or I should say has. In the late 60s, he became a bit more of a crooner with like Lay Lady Lay, and then a bit of a more natural style in the 70s. And in the 80s and 90s, and even up to now, he really sounds like he's got to clear his throat all the time. So I think the way the Beatles inspired folk musicians to go electric, I think Dylan made singers, at least in the second generation of rock and roll and beyond, understand that you didn't have to have a 5-octave vocal range to be the lead singer of a band.
Well said. Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Scott Shea, it's always so great to talk to you. I want to talk for a second about the social impact, because you mentioned Dylan's sense about himself, his voice, his music. Certainly there's a cultural and a social impact that occurred in those times with the 60s. That's not faded away. Dylan's music is still very much in vogue. Documentaries about him. He just sold his catalog. I always applaud artists that are able to really monetize against their work. And Dylan is still very much with us. And so I wonder, that social theme hasn't disappeared.
And it came swooping in back when he first came on the scene. It was a social revolution was really taking place, and you saw it in film and in art and writing and poetry. But I think music is probably the most influential form of art, and I think it still is. And like a Rolling Stone, as we said, had these really heady lyrics filled with all these metaphors and, like I said, these ironies and scathing sarcasm. And I think it really appealed to a lot of people. I think it brought all those things together and fueled the movement, for better or for worse. I mean, I think it played a part in the hippie era. I think it made people less afraid. He really kind of helped bring it. I'm sure Dylan would blanch if I said this, but if he ever heard me saying it, but he brought it to the people. Like you didn't have to be the greatest at this or that.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah.
He's maybe the greatest songwriter, but he's not the greatest singer. But I think also more importantly, it brought in that era of long jams and long songs. And I think Dylan was really part of that. And you even saw it on the pop charts. I mean, a couple of years later, you got MacArthur Park and Hey Jude, one by Richard Harris and the other by the Beatles. And they're both over 7 minutes long. And then 1971, American Pie, nearly a 9-minute song. All of those went to number one. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and you still see, and like you said, that hasn't changed. People, I think by the 1980s, the average pop hit was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. When Dylan was coming up, it had to be less than 3 minutes, because you're thinking about the radio program. So we got to have a 2-minute song because we got to squeeze in as many songs as we can in an hour and as many advertisements. For a little while, it just put the needs of radio programmers and advertising industry aside. Said, no, we're doing art for art, at least for a little while. And remnants of that have stayed, but a lot of that has come back too. So yeah, I think that's part of the enduring legacy of that song and his work.
And some of the initial reactions, I mean, you talk a little bit about the length of the song. There was some reaction to that. What were some of the other critical reactions to the song? What did some of the industry professionals have to say about Like a Rolling Stone? Because some of it was less than pleasing. There wasn't a bunch of praise initially.
Yeah, well, I think if you hated rock and roll back in those days, it's probably just added fuel to the fire,
Right.
But, I think it started really almost from the beginning, because I think Dylan and his producer, Tom Wilson, and even Columbia Records had a lot of faith in that song going into the recording session. But when they came out, take 4 was the best take they had. And that's the version we know now, with some minor overdubbing done later, the 6 minutes and 9 seconds. So they didn't really know what to do. So this young guy named Sean Considine, who was a release coordinator at Columbia Records, he found a discarded acetate of it in the trash can. And he took it to this chic discotheque called Arthur, which is in Midtown Manhattan. It was run by Richard Burton's ex-wife, Sybil. Huh. And he had the DJ there play it. And it's an acetate, so you can only get like 5 or 6 plays out of it before it completely deteriorates. And the response was overwhelming. And it's a club loaded with celebrities. So there's a couple like top 40 AM DJs. I don't know who they were. I mean, maybe like Dan Ingram or Harry Harrison or somebody sitting there. And they heard it and they loved it. The next day, they're calling Columbia Records asking for a stereo promo single. So that got Columbia back into, let's press this as it is. The session was in early to mid-June. The single came out in June 28th. So this is just all happens within a couple of weeks. And next thing you know, it's July 24th. It's hitting 91 which we're talking about today.
Yeah.
It's number 91 on the Billboard Top 100, and it shoots within a matter of weeks. It's at number 2. I think that success speaks for itself for the reaction. The sales are always the good reaction, especially with a song. But I think over time it's had the long-term reaction to it is the most important thing. Like Bruce Springsteen talks about hearing that song for the first time, riding with his mom in the car, hearing it on WMCA out of New York, and just being blown away, and how it would go on to influence his songwriting when he started taking that up a couple of years. Paul Rothchild, who was the Doors producer in the late 60s and early 70s, he was a young producer at Elektra Records. And he hears that, and he's an ex-folk musician, and he hears that, and he knew all about Dylan, and he's like, wow, if somebody like Bob can make a song like this, I can do that too. So it changed his direction, and it influenced so many people. Van Morrison, Neil Young, Frank Zappa, even Elvis Costello talks about how important that song was to him when he first heard it. So I think the immediate reaction, big hit, Columbia didn't believe in it. They got some reassurance. They put it out, hits number 2. And then it just becomes just like, look, it's 2024 and you and I are doing a half-hour segment dedicated to it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It really was a generational song. What do you think would have happened to Dylan if, in his career particularly, if Like a Rolling Stone hadn't been the success that it was? Do you think he still would figure in this pantheon, this real influential figure that he is today? You think that still would have occurred? I mean, he's written some amazing music.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, because, if that didn't happen, what would have happened after that? Would they have dropped him?
He almost quit singing after that return from England, right? Just kind of on the eve of recording this song?
Yeah, I mean, he was under a lot of pressure just from the folk community. I mean, the folk music community, and that was far from mainstream. He's trying to get into the world of pop music, and that's where the pressure's 10 times greater. Many times in his career, he's thought about just hanging it up, but that was probably the first time I know he wanted to just retire. And I think he'd already done enough at that point to be considered legendary, but it may have been relegated to really just kind of being like a folk legend like Pete Seeger or Woody Guthrie, not to diminish those guys because they're incredible, but they're kind of pigeonholed in folk music and they're not necessarily mainstream. I don't think your average person would know a Pete Seeger song or could name one, but they could name a Dylan song, you know, or he might have just gone on to be considered a great writer of other people's hits, kind of like Jimmy Webb or P.F. Sloan, these guys that there's a lot in the country music field that just wrote songs for others and we're just happy doing that. Maybe occasionally they put out an album. I don't think there's any doubt he would have been influential, but probably would have been a much more niche.
Well, Scott Shea, thanks for being so generous. And I've just enjoyed talking to you about Like a Rolling Stone. Our listeners, our 60 plus age audience, all of whom are familiar with Dylan's work. What's kind of your ranking of some of these songs beneath Like a Rolling Stone that we should really still be paying attention to and maybe pull out, dust off, listen to a little bit and really get an understanding of who Dylan was and the impact that he's really played?
Well, you can never go wrong with the greatest hits.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, but if you're like me, I've never been a greatest hits guy. I kind of like to get to the meat of the thing. And I think if you really like Rolling Stone, I'd recommend that trifecta of his mid-60s electric albums, because not only are the songs and their arrangements enjoyable, but it's kind of interesting to listen to that progression. Like a Rolling Stone is on the Highway 61 Revisited album from 65, which is the middle LP. But the first of those albums, Bringing It All Back Home, it's a little bit more mild. One half of the album is all acoustic. It's very reminiscent of his folk albums before that, but it's got some incredible new stuff on there, like Mr. Tambourine Man, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and It's All Right, Mom, I'm Only Dreaming. But the other half is his electric debut, and it's just got some incredible stuff on it. But I love Blonde on Blonde, and that came out in 66. That was his follow-up to the Highway 61 album. It's the last of the 3 series there of those mid-60s rock albums. It's grandiose. It's a double album. It's all electric, really some over-the-top things in there, like penny whistles and trumpets, and Bob really stretches out the syllables, you know, but it is power packed, and it's got songs like Just Like a Woman, I Want You, Stuck Inside a Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again. But, you know, also, if you really like laid back, the dust settling from all that period, I really like the Nashville Skyline album from 1969, which has Lay Lady Lay on it, and even the John Wesley Harding album before that. And anything, you know, I really like Bob up until about the mid-70s. I love him after that, but there's an inevitable drop-off that every artist, every legend has. But there's always good stuff that you can glean from.
Scott Shea, thanks for joining us today. I always enjoy talking to you. I always learn so much. I know our audience does, but you've helped us mark this anniversary of Like a Rolling Stone. What a great time. What a great song. I always say this to you. You've been on the program before and talked to us about the Mamas and the Papas and your book, All the Leaves Are Brown, which is excellent. Everybody check that book out. But Scott, thanks for joining us today. Please come back. I would love to talk to you again. Always love hearing your take on all this music.
Absolutely. And if people want to learn a little bit more, they can go to my website, scottsheaauthor.com. That's SHEA. And it's got the links to all my socials there, so you can follow me and see what I'm up to.
We'll put links in our notes today so that you can find out more about Scott and his work, his wonderful book about the Mamas and the Papas, his work titled All the Leaves Are Brown. Thanks, Scott, for joining us today. And we'll be talking to you soon, but have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Paul. You too.
My thanks to Scott Shea for all his work and expertise. You'll find out more about Scott on our website via the links in the show notes today. But I love to talk to Scott because he's a preserver and lover of vintage music from the 1940s through the 1990s. Scott will join us again soon. My thanks to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show. My thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Also, I want to thank Sam Henniger, our executive producer, Miranda Henniger, our team admin, who we thank profusely for helping us stay on task. Please be well, all of you. Be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.